Hi, everyone, and welcome to Flipping the Script, a podcast where we expand on climate change issues in Vancouver, focusing on the voices of those who aren't usually heard in the mainstream news. Your hosts for this three-series event are Siyu, Shawn, and Humaira. We're all students attending Simon Fraser University and are holding this event as part of the Creator 120 project for Communications 120 with Nicole Stewart. Today we'll be discussing the topic of flooding, hosted by Siyu. Before we begin our discussion, Siyu will give a summary on their topic. Siyu, you can take it away.
All right, thank you, Humaira. So, hi guys, I'm Siyu, and I'm very excited to be a part of Flipping the Script, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So, among the international hot topics of climate change in recent years, flood disasters are one of the important issues that are always discussed along with climate change. Floods can form for a number of reasons, such as excessive rainfall in a period of time in a certain area, a large amount of melting snow and ice, etc. Whatever it is, the cause, as I said earlier, is related to the unusual climate. Floods indicate serious environmental and climatic problems as the dust, debris, animal bodies, and the industrial effluents brought by floods, among others, can cause further environmental pollution and even damage to water supply facilities and sewage disposal conditions to varying degrees. However, flooding is definitely not just an environmental issue, but also harmful to people and the society in other ways that cannot be ignored. Chief Patrick Mitchell has spoken on the podcast Below the Radar about the huge blow their community, Kanakabar, is taking in the face of climate change and extreme weather. Kanakabar is located in the Fraser Canyon at the midway point between Hope and Lillooet, which has been the traditional territory for the community for over 7,000 years. According to Chief Patrick Mitchell, from 1992 to 2021, the Kanakabar has been issuing warning signs about climate change, and he has spoken to the BC government and all the other chiefs of the BC since 2019. In 2021, however, their communities still receive the effects of extreme weather, that their roads have been destroyed by floods, by extreme rain and snow. Yeah, they've always provided documents and made some comments to the government over the years. Yet, apparently, the government has never been able to act in a timely manner. They always realize the problem after the disaster has actually arrived. Yeah, that means these indigenous communities have really been severely impacted, but it could have been avoided, right? So do you guys have any comments?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up how specific Indigenous communities have dealt with the flooding, since their communities face an additional set of setbacks when comparing it to non-Indigenous residents. And to add on to your comment, how despite there being evidence of documents, the government still takes no actions, we can talk about the ways that the government is dealing with these Indigenous groups the same way they deal with non-Indigenous citizens. So they're essentially applying these strategies that they apply to the rest of the citizens in Canada onto these Indigenous groups, even though they face an additional amount of setbacks. So something I was looking into was this article that discusses how, quote, there has been no comprehensive national scale assessment of flood risk to Indigenous communities in Canada that combines hazard and exposure data with a measure of social vulnerability, end quote. So I think this brings in the concept of intersectionality and how by having an intersectional perspective on flooding and applying this perspective onto Indigenous communities, we can consider how Indigenous communities face these additional elements of vulnerability that make the previous government policies not applicable to them. Yeah, Shawn, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I like how you brought up the idea of intersectionality, which is the idea of considering multiple social markers such as race, gender, class, etc., and how all these identity markers play a role in one's life experiences.
Cool, thank you guys. And it's also worth noting that the government was at the same time working on the construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline through indigenous territories that had not been agreed to. The project was strongly opposed not only because it would compress the living space of indigenous people, but also because the ecosystem could not handle it and it was inconsistent with the climate crisis. Well, there is a town not far from Kanakabar called Layton, which also suffers from extreme weather. It was mentioned by the decision makers and leaders of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. This actually proves that they understand the impact that building the pipeline will have on these places, and they understand that it's wrong to build the pipeline in this climate emergency. It's just that they value the benefits of the Trans Mountain Pipeline more than anything else. There may be some points in these that make the connection between colonization and climate change, such as this notion of domination over the land. It's like looking at the river and measuring its value by how much whales the fish in it bring us, or how much gold is hidden in the sand. This is not a true understanding of the intrinsic value of nature's resources. It's true that a river or we say trans mountain pipeline can bring direct economic benefits, but this is clearly not in line with sustainable development strategies. We tend to see only the external value of natural resources, about how much money they can make us, while ignoring their intrinsic value, leading us to pay a more painful price, like the destruction of indigenous communities, and also including the economic aspect.
See, if I could add, I think it's imperative for us as a community in British Columbia to start weighing the threat of climate change seriously. We need to prioritize it over economic gain and financial benefit, and to start getting a real change. Not only are we destroying these communities with an abundant amount of history, we are accelerating the effects of the climate crisis that we are facing right now.
Yeah, and I'm also glad you brought up the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Siyu, because it makes me think about social activism, and especially in relation to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I'm sure we've all seen the rallies that they have, and it also makes me think of government action in relation to our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and how in the beginning of his running for Prime Minister, how he promised Indigenous peoples that he would help them in ways that they weren't recognized before, and how he hasn't lived up to any of those promises.
Thank you, guys. And when it comes to the economy, it's also important to know how the Vancouver society can cope with a disaster like flood. So in True Study, how society resists the risks and the impacts of flooding is described as social resilience. So according to this research, this social resilience is highly correlated with the economy, particularly household, individual income, and housing values. We can say that the extent to which Vancouver can withstand the impacts of flooding disasters is highly dependent on the economy. In addition to this, he also points out that this individual level effect on social resilience may be incomplete due to the lack of sufficient data in the study. That is, this does not mean that social resilience is significantly represented only at the individual level. By linking these individual level findings to the context of social resilience and the placing them in the context of the real world, disaster planning and the mitigation then is not just at the individual level, but in the context of integrated units such as the communities and the neighborhood.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the concept of social resilience. I think we can tie back that concept to our solutions, because it definitely highlights the ways that we can't only view these as environmental issues, but systemic issues that result in further disparities, especially when we are thinking of Indigenous communities such as the Kanaka Bar. Yeah, Shawn, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I feel like the last couple of years there have been, climate disasters happening abundantly over the summertime, from the wildfires to the heat dome we sustained last summer and even the floods late last year. The social resilience of British Columbians has been tested. Like how we initially responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and its shutdown, we as humans often resort to panicking as we are uncertain about how the future will play out and if we have enough resources to sustain living. Going back to the first initial COVID-19 induced shutdown, people panicked and bought anything they could get their hands on at the grocery store. I mean, toilet paper was a rare commodity at these times. And I feel like social media kind of drove that with often pictures of, empty lanes of grocery stores being empty of toilet paper. And this kind of model highlights how humans have this selfish tendency at moments of crises. We look at the health of us and our loved ones and prioritize that as we should, but we also overstock on supplies in moments of panic. We are leaving those most vulnerable with the least amount of supplies.
Oh, yeah, and one more point I want to make is that resilience is the ability of a system to respond to the external stresses and the disruptions. And in this case, specifically, the ability of society to cope with flood disasters, as I said before. This assessment is now being used with an emphasis on disaster risk management policies. Because the indicators for assessing social resilience are comprehensive, the study includes indicators for flooding as well as for communities, the economy, and the population, among others. Overall, social resilience is a comprehensive assessment that can provide a useful reference for disaster risk reduction. And as well as some of the earlier mentions about government policies dealing with indigenous communities through the concept of social resilience and some of the indicators, we can also understand why we need to consider additional measures or policies for indigenous groups, because we can say that indigenous and non-indigenous communities are two different systems, and they cannot be considered in the same category in terms of economy, population, and other indicators. Yeah. And I also want to talk about how we as communication students can connect media platforms, especially podcasts, which is what we are doing right now, to flood disasters. So Grace Nosek says, podcasting is one of our greatest weapons against climate inaction because it's all the stories people could possibly have. These compromising conversations, raw and vulnerable, are telling their own personal stories. Although what we are doing here is almost just a retelling of their perspectives as experts in fighting environmental issues, we still have a different focus on the same view in this podcast conversation. And these different focuses are different perspectives, and ideas that can provide new thinking on the topics we're exploring.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in how you brought up storytelling as an important platform. Something I always come back to when I'm thinking about storytelling is the Indigenous novelist Thomas King and his novel The Truth About Stories. So he discusses the ways that stories can control our lives and even influence how we interact with the world. So first he tells a story of Adam and Eve from a Christian perspective, and then he draws upon Indigenous perspectives and their stories that they tell and how different these two ideologies can influence how people look at the world. Yeah, and also thinking about storytelling in with the role of social media. Going back to what Shawn said earlier, I really do think that it highlights how social media plays a role in just how much we kind of the ways that we view these issues and what's important and what's not, especially thinking about the first pandemic and with toilet paper and viewing that as like a scarce commodity, even though it really wasn't. Yeah, and then drawing back to storytelling. So kind of combining social media with storytelling, I think that you should consider the integration of media platforms and storytelling together, and especially in an educational setting. So this could be a possible solution. So in elementaries and secondary schools, I think that when we're raising awareness, at least in my own experience, and I'm sure that you guys have similar experiences, but when we were taught about Indigenous issues, we weren't really told about the systemic issues. It was just very surface level. So obviously we can't really understand that. So I think that we need to have less of a focus on even these like textbooks and expand from a settler colonial perspective and get more non-settler perspectives through the integration of media platforms. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could butt in for a sec, I feel like what social media also does is that it's good and bad. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to social media and there's a lot of bad things about social media. But with social media today, I feel like we can get more stories from the people who were actually affected by these moments in history and can give us new views and new stories about what really happened from their point of view.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's more like an opportunity for everyone to participate. Yeah, in the new media age, everyone has the opportunity to enter the media industry and participate in the discussion of, let's say, environmental issues. We can take a picture of environmental around us and upload it to like TikTok or Instagram and give comments and suggestions, which is actually already a kind of participation or interaction in environmental issues. Yeah. And also for the official, for the mainstream medias, I think the public's need for information should also be very urgent in this kind of environmental emergency. So for the government, for the officials, the media should also have the responsibility to disclose environmental problems timely and accurately, because as residents of Vancouver, of the Earth, yeah, we have the right and the obligation to know the current situation of environment we live in. Okay. So far we have gone from the flood to colonizing ideas, economies, societies, and even media platforms. Although it may seem extensive, this is actually the point I want to emphasize, which is that environmental issues are relevant to all aspects of people's well-being. Scientists also predict that in 2100, the next century, the intensity of winter flooding in the Pacific Northwest will increase dramatically, and the sea levels also could rise by more than 1 meter. So Vancouver as a coastal city, there is no doubt that the consequences of this are dire. So finally, I would like to end with a quote from Chief Patrick Mitchell. The secret is to quit talking and start doing. It's time for action.